Okay, so here we are in chapter 2, and I decided to go ahead and make a video lecture for this chapter. I'd love to do in class, I'd love to do a little more hands-on, small groups, you guys working together to answer questions, but I know some of you would really love to just kind of hear a brief explanation of this chapter. So I know chemistry isn't everyone's favorite, right? You're like, I'm in a biology class, why do I need to know this, right? But keep in mind that organisms, well, one, their basis is chemistry, right? They are made up of elements. They're constantly interacting with other elements. And so they are, they have to follow these laws, right, of things like chemistry and physics. And so those really are often kind of backbone studies of biology. So organisms are composed of matter. Okay, so matter is really anything that takes up space and has mass. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at how this chemistry of matter works. So here's an interesting one. So we're going to talk about elements, right? And this is a substance that can't be broken into any other substance due to a chemical reaction, right? It's the smallest, most basic form of matter there is. You can put multiple elements together. So here we see sodium, one element, which is it's like a solid. It's not like a rock, but it's tough. You can see this person cutting it with a knife. If you put it with chlorine, which is a gas, we can get a compound, and a compound just has two or more elements together in like a fixed ratio. And so we make sodium chloride or table salt, which looks nothing like and acts nothing like either of those parent elements. And so we get these, we talked last time a little bit about emergent properties, properties that arise at a slightly higher level of organization. And we get to salt our food. So when we talk about elements and we talk about matter, you're probably somewhat familiar with this periodic table of the elements. Now, you don't have to memorize this. We'll talk a little bit about it today. I want you to be comfortable enough that you can work with the periodic table as a tool, like that you could look things up on it, but I'm not expecting you to memorize these sorts of things. And frankly, when it comes down to it, when you look at life, most life is made up of very few elements. So it's like 95, 96% of living matter is made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, right? 96% of a human being is those four elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, right? A lot of that last 4% is things like calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur. And so most of the periodic table of the elements doesn't mean a whole lot to life. Less than a quarter of them are considered essential or required for living organisms. There are some elements that are required in really small amounts, but they are still required, right? They could be essential elements, but we would call those trace elements. Maybe something like what's a good example on here? Like molybdenum. I think we need in like super teeny tiny amounts. Okay, so when we look at elements, their properties, what they're like, are they a gas, are they a solid, right? All those properties depend on the structure of the atoms. So each element consists of unique atoms. An atom is just the smallest unit of matter that still retains the property of that element. So they're composed of subatomic particles: protons, neutrons, and electrons. And so you can see those here on the screen. Protons with a positive sign, they are a positively charged ion. They are found in the nucleus, the center of the atom. The neutrons here are in brown, and they have no charge, so we don't see a symbol there. They are also in the nucleus. The electrons are negatively charged subatomic particles, and they're found out in what we'll call orbitals, and we'll look at that arrangement a little bit more. The other kind of portion of like chemistry and physics that overlies biology, other than matter, is energy, right? So one of those core themes, central themes of biology was talking about how organisms deal with both energy and matter. Energy is just the capacity to cause change, right, or to do work. And so what we're going to see in biology class is that some processes, so I'll get my pointer over here, right, some reactions, so here we have reactants and products. So if I drew an arrow here, right, whoop, you would see that process taking place. Some of these actually require energy, right? Those are called endothermic reactions. Endothermic reactions, you can see how much energy we actually had to put into this reaction to get it to take place, and it's absorbing energy, it's requiring energy. Other reactions are exothermic. You might still have to like light a spark to kick it off, but then notice the products, their ultimate energy is actually lower, so they're releasing energy. What we'll see in life is the pairing of exothermic and endothermic reactions, right? So you digest food, you had a Snickers bar, and you release that energy. And this is all within your cells, it's not like coming out of you, right? But you release that energy, and then your cells are going to take that energy and do endothermic reactions. They're going to maybe build some new proteins, right? Or something like that. And so we will see this relationship of energy a lot. Now, when we look at energy within atoms, what we're looking at is really where the electrons are located compared to the nucleus. So this picture is trying to show you that when we talk about orbitals, when we talk about these kind of clouds or areas that the electrons will be concentrated in, right? The closer to the nucleus you are, the less energy there is. Kind of like they're showing here coming down a flight of stairs. If you rolled a ball off that bottom step, there's not a whole lot of energy, right, being released there. But if you started it all the way at the top flight of stairs, there's actually a lot of potential energy when electrons are in these further out shells. So there's another good term. Potential energy is the energy that matter has because of its location or structure, right? So higher up on that staircase, further away from the nucleus of an atom. And so electrons in an atom differ in the amount of potential energy they have depending on which shell or which orbital they're in. And so this is going to make a big difference in how these elements act, right? The chemical behavior of an atom is determined by where those electrons are. And the way the periodic table is set up becomes a clue for how many electrons there are, how they're arranged, and therefore how they're going to behave. So let's take a peek at that. So this is just kind of a much smaller portion of the periodic table that's really kind of been simplified. It just includes the first 18, but you will find all of our super important elements here, right? Carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and there's nitrogen, right? So that's most of the elements that are going to be important in life. So notice what happens here. Basically, every column, every vertical column in the periodic table tells you how many electrons are in this outer orbital. So here we see hydrogen only has a single electron in its outer orbital. Lithium has 3 electrons, but only 1 in its outer orbital. Sodium has 11 electrons, but only 1 in its outer orbital. So if you're in that first column, you always have 1 in your outer orbital, right? Here we see 2 in the outer orbital, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now you're like, wait, there's 2. So the first orbital, the first shell that comes off of the nucleus, can only hold 2 electrons max. From then on out, we're looking at a shell holding 8 electrons. Basically, if all those orbitals are full, if they have as many electrons as they can possibly handle, 2 or 8, this element really becomes inert. Most of the interactions that are taking place between elements really has to do with wanting to share or steal these electrons. And helium's going, I'm set. I don't need anything from anyone, right? So anyway, right, there's a lot of information in this periodic table. Okay, if you look at the rows, notice that hydrogen and helium only have 1 shell. So everybody in that first row only has one shell. It can only have a max of 2 electrons. As you move down a row into that second, you get a second shell. So here we see lithium with 2 electrons on that inner shell, and then 1 electron in the outer shell. So I could ask you, right? I mean, like, I can now say, hey, tell me more about boron. And just by looking at the periodic table, you should know that it has 2 shells, and that outer shell is going to have, right? So 2 shells because it's in the second row, and that outer shell is going to have 3 electrons because it's in the third column, all right? Anyway, so that's going to help. Again, you should be able to work your way around the periodic table. These are some hints to help you do that. And if you do take a chemistry class, you'll obviously get much more into this. Okay, a couple other things that you need to know to kind of understand the periodic table and really use it as a tool. So we looked at how there's neutrons and protons in the nucleus of an atom. When we how do I say this? So they have weight. They have enough. They have mass, right? They're almost identical, neutron and protons, and they're measured in a unit called daltons. It's just the old dead dude who discovered them, right? But each is worth 1 dalton, right? So each proton and neutron is worth a dalton. Now, how you tell what an element is actually by its number of protons. And so on the periodic table, they will give you what is called the atomic number. The atomic number is the number of protons in that nucleus. Okay? That's also usually a pretty good indication then of how many neutrons are in there and how many electrons are in there. But okay, so the atomic number tells you the number of protons. This number down here is the atomic mass, right? So if every proton and neutron weighs a dalton, right? Here we have 4. So we've got 2 protons, and then we could do 4 minus 2 and say there's 2 neutrons. Now, if you're going, well, what's the 0.003? Atomic mass actually is an average of all the isotopes of this element. So we'll talk a little bit more about isotopes, and basically what can happen is, well, let's just do it. So what can happen is normally in a neutral atom, if you had 2 protons, you would have 2 neutrons. An isotope has a different number of neutrons. So maybe there's a 3rd proton in some atoms of, what do we hear? Helium. Okay, it always has 2 protons. If you change the number of protons, you actually change the element, right? If you go, so we were on helium, oops, sorry, I can't point to the screen. Here we go. We were on helium, right? 2 protons, 2 electrons. If you add a 3rd proton, it becomes lithium, right? The atomic number of lithium is 3. There's 3 protons. Okay, so if you change the number of protons, you change the element. If you change the number of neutrons, you have an isotope. And so the atomic mass is truly an average of all the isotopes of, in this case, helium. So we can tell that there are a very small portion of helium atoms that may actually have an extra neutron. And that's why the atomic mass is often not just an even number. We won't work a whole lot in isotopes. Okay, now the electrons we have not really included in this. They're so small that we essentially don't assign their weight, right? But like I mentioned before, they are key in understanding the interactions that are going to take place between different atoms. Again, this is maybe getting a little further than we need to go. For me, if you know that there's multiple shells, that the inner shell holds 2 electrons, and then outside of that it holds 8, we're great. If you're going to continue on, what you'll find is in chemistry, they'll get into the shapes of this a little more. So that inner orbital is called an s orbital or spherical orbital. It only holds 2 electrons. That next s orbital or spherical orbital can hold up to 8. And then you start getting into these p orbitals that are shaped more like an ellipsis. And anyway, down here, then they're showing you how they all overlay on each other. So it's really not just this nice, neat concentric circles. There's electrons kind of going all over the place, right? It's more like a cloud. But these orbitals really do help us kind of visualize something that maybe it's not as concrete and true, right? I mean, it's like this electron doesn't just sit right there. It's actually in this cloud circulating around the nucleus. So the orbital is a three-dimensional space where the electron is found 90% of the time, right? So it's not kind of stuck in this orbital. All right. Let's see. We don't need to go into all that. Okay. So then let's talk about bonding real quick. So that was your quick little lecture on subatomic particles and kind of where they hang out and how to use a periodic table. I would say where it becomes more interesting is as you start thinking about the interactions between these different atoms. So we've got a few different kinds of bonding. So covalent bonding, ionic bonding, and hydrogen bonding are going to be the main things that we look at in biology. So in a covalent bond, a pair of valence electrons, outer electrons, are shared by two atoms. Right? Basically, so in this covalent bond, when we have this sharing, each atom then counts it as part of its electron orbital. So what they're showing you here are actually two hydrogen atoms. Now, hydrogen's atomic number is 1, so we know it has 1 proton. Now, hydrogen, then you can kind of infer that the number, unless it's an ion, you can infer that the number of electrons is the same. So if each of these hydrogen atoms has 1 proton and 1 electron, right, its outer shell only has 1 electron. Its outer shell can hold 2 electrons. And so the way I kind of think about this is, again, when an atom has its outer shell filled, it's in its happy place. It feels complete. Life is good, right? And so until it gets that full valence shell, full outer shell, it's just not satisfied. And so a hydrogen atom only has 1 electron. It can hold 2. And so what these atoms decide to do is to share. They form a covalent bond. And so there we go. Now we're calling this molecule H2, and this kind of orange schmutz here is that electron cloud, right? So you picture that single electron floating around each of these. Well, now it's going to spend time around both of those, of the nucleus of both of those atoms, and so each feels like it has 2, therefore complete and happy. And so this is going to be a really stable molecule. It's going to be hard to pop it apart because it's so happy in that relationship. Okay? And so how molecules bond then really has to do with the atom's valence electrons, right? What's available there. Covalent bonds form between atoms of the same element or different elements. So here we see H2. That's the one we were just looking at. So see how those 2 electrons now spend some time here and some time there. And this picture is nice. They show you a few different ways to kind of symbolize this. I like this model here. It's called a Lewis dot structure. So you show both electrons just with little dots, and they're kind of shared between those 2 hydrogens. A single line indicates a covalent bond as well. When you get to something like oxygen, so what we're inhaling, it's O2, which tells you there's 2 oxygen molecules. We'll spend some time playing with this in class, but if you look at oxygen, it has 6 electrons in its valence shell, and it wants 8. Good. And so it's going to share, each is going to share 2, and then both end up feeling like they have 8. So notice now there's 2 shared pairs of electrons here. So 4 dots, 2 shared pairs, or 2 lines shows a double covalent bond, right? So it can be of the same element, or it can be between different elements, right? We would call that a compound where you have 2 or more different elements together. They're attracted to varying degrees, and some of this has to do with what's called electronegativity. And electronegativity is really a chemistry term. even if you just think about size, that'll work. So look at water here, right? So oxygen, oxygen's atomic number is 8, right? So 8 protons, probably 8 neutrons, 8 electrons. It's a decent sized molecule, or sorry, decent sized atom. Hydrogen is tiny, 1 proton, 1 electron. And so when you think about the interactions between this behemoth oxygen and this teeny tiny hydrogen, how well do you think they're sharing that electron, right? We're actually, the oxygen is kind of hogging this electron, but so the hydrogen is very strongly attracted to that oxygen. So electronegativity is really talking about the pull of one atom on another. So, but what that ends up setting up, water is a perfect example. Here we go. Water is a perfect example. The covalent bond that forms between oxygen and hydrogen in a water molecule is referred to as a polar covalent bond. These top ones were non-polar, which means the electrons are shared equally. In a polar covalent bond, one atom's more electronegative, in this case the oxygen, and so the electrons aren't shared equally. And so you've got this little funny symbol up here, kind of looks like an S. It just means partial. So the oxygen is hogging the electrons, and so you end up with a partial negative charge on this end of the molecule. The electrons aren't spending as much time down here by hydrogen, and so we get a partial positive charge on that end. And we will talk more in chapter 3 about this idea of polar molecules, huge, into a ton of different reasons that water is so special and so important in life. So tuck that one away, polar covalent bonds. Okay, so we had covalent bonds, electrons are being shared. Whether that's equal or not, they're sharing electrons. The other kind of major type of bonding is what's called an ionic bond. Now, an ion is any time an atom has a different number of protons and electrons. So check out what's happening here. So sodium, we've got 2 on the inside, and then another 8, so that's 10, 11. And that matches up. The atomic number of sodium is 11. So it has 11 protons, and usually it has 11 electrons. But notice this electron out in this valence shell all by itself, like, it's lonely, and this molecule would be much more satisfied if it had 8 electrons in the outer shell. And so what happens is it'll actually pretty easily lose that electron, lose that whole shell, and then it'll feel like its outer shell only has 8 electrons, and it's going to be quite content there, right? But then it has 1 more proton than it does neutron. And so what we're going to end up with, I might be able to write on here. What we're going to end up with, maybe not. Yeah, there it is sodium, as an ion, Na+. That indicates there's an extra proton, an extra positive charge, compared to the number of electrons, right? We haven't added a proton, we've actually removed an electron, and that makes it positively charged. Okay, so that would be an ion, right? A charged atom. It has an unequal number of protons and electrons. Okay. In this case, where that electron ends up going is to this chlorine atom. So chlorine, atomic number of 17, has 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 electrons in its outer shell. It wants 1 more. And so sure enough, that electron moves over here, making a ion, Cl-, right? It has now, the book did that for you. There you go. Look at that. Cl- and Na+. But now you have a positive ion. This is called an cation. I'm not going to be able to do this very well. Cation. That's a positively charged ion. And then over here, yep, almost circled that, we have an anion. Okay. Opposites attract, right? So our positive ion and our negative ion are now attracted, and they form an ionic bond, right? It's a bond between two ions. That's sodium chloride. Okay, just a reminder, in case I lost anyone on that, the cation is the positively charged ion, anion is the negatively charged ion, and the ionic bond is the attraction between them, right? But so that all kind of started out by electrons being, stolen or donated, whichever way you want to think about it, to form those ions. Okay. Ionic bonds, you'll often find those in like a crystalline form, like we do here with table salt, and you get this repeating pattern of positive sodiums, negative chlorides. Okay, so those are the two major bonds. Hydrogen bonds. So there's a couple weak bonds. Hydrogen bonds are weak bonds. Excuse me. Basically, what we're going to see happen here is a hydrogen atom that's part of a covalent bond. So let's just, this guy right here, right? This hydrogen is part of this covalent bond, right? We said it was sharing electrons with oxygen, but it wasn't sharing them evenly. So a hydrogen bond forms, this dotted line here. A hydrogen bond forms when a hydrogen atom that's covalently bonded to a very electronegative molecule, say oxygen in this case, is attracted to another electronegative atom. So down here we have ammonia, and you can see how huge nitrogen is as well, and that we set up a partial negative as it is covalently bonded to other hydrogens. And so that's a really complicated way to say it's always going to involve, a hydrogen bond always involves hydrogen, and basically it's going to be the partial positive of one polar molecule being attracted to the partial negative of another polar molecule. Hydrogen bonding, again, so essential in a lot of life, and it's kind of it confuses people because you go, well, it's a weak bond, who cares? But this is actually the bond that holds the two strands of DNA together, and it's actually perfect that it's weak because that means you can actually pull the DNA apart if you want to make a copy, right? And it'll glue itself back together due to the attraction of these hydrogens, of these polar molecules. So we will see a lot of hydrogen bonding. The one we won't talk about is another weak bond called a van der Waals interaction. And basically this is going to happen when electrons aren't evenly distributed. Just by chance, they might kind of all end up on one side of a molecule. And so you get these attractions due to that. And this is important in things like cling wrap and the feet of geckos. So kind of cool, but not maybe essential in understanding life. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so when we talk about molecules, right, we've got multiple atoms together, and their shape ends up being really important to how it functions, right? So form follows function. We talked about that. The shape of the molecule influences its function. And that shape's determined by the positions in the atom's orbitals. And what we'll find is this is where it becomes more important, not just to think about the orbitals as little circles, but honestly where they're kind of arranged in real life. The only one that you really should worry about at this point is water, right? And so when we look at a water molecule, it literally is, I mean, look at this. They've measured the 180 is a flat line, right? Here would be 180. They've measured the angle that the hydrogens come off the oxygen, and we know it as precisely as 104.5 degrees. That precisely, that is where this hydrogen sits, and this is related to where those electrons are in their orbitals. And so this is going to make some different shapes depending on kind of what those electron orbitals are. And again, without getting into the details, this is what you want to know for biology, right? So the shape is really important to the function. And so here's an interesting thing, right? So you actually produce endorphins, right? This is a natural chemical that's produced. It binds to a receptor on a cell, and this is a molecule that gives you good feelings, right? So you produce endorphins when you exercise, right? And so that can help calm maybe some anxieties and things like that. Morphine is basically a molecular mimic. So notice how similar these two shapes look. So it has enough similarities that it can actually bind to that same receptor in the brain. And so it gives you some of those same feelings, those high feelings. And so this is how a lot of pharmacology and blocks pain too, right? And this is how a lot of pharmacology is set up, looking at what chemicals the body uses naturally and then trying to copy them. Okay, I think, couple more. Oh, that's what I want to talk about. So reactions. So chemical reactions are the making and breaking of those bonds that we just talked about. So covalent bonds, ionic bonds, whatever. This is important terminology, right? So the starting substances that are going to go into this reaction are called reactants. And once the reaction takes place, we produce products. Okay. And this is we're looking at this as being fairly straightforward. We can take two hydrogen molecules. So notice the covalent bond, single covalent bond between each of those hydrogens. So two H2 molecules, an O2 molecule, there's our double covalent bond. And in this reaction, we can rearrange things. And what is this molecule? Water. Good. So we make H2O. We make two H2O in this product. And so you'll see me kind of write chemical equations kind of like that a lot, the arrow indicating the direction that the reaction takes place. These can get super complicated. Check out this one. This is photosynthesis. So there's our actual chemical formula for photosynthesis, right? 6 carbon dioxide, 6 water, throw some sunlight in there for your energy, and we can rearrange all those molecules into a big complex molecule like glucose, and then oxygen as a byproduct, right? So this would be a great example of one of those endothermic reactions where it actually requires energy to take place. Okay, that is it. All the rest of this is just a review of what we just talked about. So if at the end of your chapter they do a really nice job, if you need to see again kind of this idea of, okay, where were those protons, neutrons, and electrons located? What does a bond look like? So you take two hydrogens with their one electron, and you can put that together into a single covalent bond. Here's that summary of the ionic bond again, if you want to see that. So on Thursday, have read this chapter, thought about some of these processes, and I'd love to spend a lot of the time kind of breaking into smaller groups and working through some problems and making sure that everyone's really understanding what's going on here. So have a great evening, and we will see you soon.